Hello, everyone. Welcome to our 11th SIETAR anti-racism learning session. As you know, we run it in order to educate ourselves and our member on anti-racism and its intersectionality with the intercultural field. Today, it's an honor and a big task to introduce Dr. Livingstone Thomas, who will introduce also Dr. Alvina Grosu. Many people, they already know Dr. Livingstone Thomas. I just want to say a couple of words. Dr. Livingstone Thomas is a diversity and inclusion trainer. We is specializing in cross-cultural interaction, cultural competence training, as well as relocation, coaching, and training. Before Dr. Livingstone Thomas giving you the floor, I just want to share with you only 52 seconds of handy Herbie Hancock.
Folks are not seeing the screen.
Thank you so much. It was the last month on 30 April during the International Day of Jazz. We, for the UNESCO, United Nations for Education, Science and Culture. It means at the beginning, jazz wasn't academic music, but right now we can find jazz in many universities across the world. And right now, Dr. Livingstone Thomas, over to you.
Thank you, Papa. Livingston Thompson is my name, and it's my pleasure to welcome all the those who have joined us for the session this afternoon. SIETAR Europe is pleased to be able to, of course, deliver this session. And before I tell you about Alvina Grosu, who is a colleague, a friend, and troublemaker, let me say a little bit about this issue of unconscious bias and the subject matter we hope to raise here this evening. This is the first of two sessions that we're having. The second session will be later on in June, on the 2nd of June, and that session will be a panel discussion. In that panel discussion, we're going to be picking up some of the issues that are raised here today, but we're going to be looking much more at the practical application and use of unconscious bias as it is in training or in academia. This evening, or this afternoon, what we want to focus on is what exactly is unconscious bias. The whole issue of unconscious bias was thrown into, as it is used in training, was thrown into a little bit of disarray sometime during last year when a leading European government, specifically the UK government, said that they would no longer be using in the public training unconscious bias training because the research had established that it does not work and it was not delivering what it was claiming that it would deliver. This, of course, becomes very critical for those of us who are in the field of intercultural and diversity and inclusion training, and for those individuals for whom unconscious bias training is, in a sense, a core part of what they do. If a leading government in Europe is saying that it does not work, and how does that then impact the claims that we as practitioners make when we use unconscious bias training? When the terminology in and of itself. It was for that reason that Dr. Grosu and we considered that this was an important thing that we should therefore explore, revisit, go back, so to speak, to the foundation to look at this issue of unconscious bias. So Dr. Grosu comes with the appropriate knowledge and academic investigation, in my judgment, to be able to look at this subject matter. She has her PhD in cross-cultural psychology. She is a clinical psychologist. She has investigated this matter with care. And one of the benefits I have in relation to working with her, we had the pleasure of being the founders, so to speak, of SIETAR Ireland. And so the whole field relating to interculturalism is something that we have looked at together. One of the issues that we have worked on, for example, has to do with a project called the Globe Project, which looked at the issue of the relationship between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, as how practitioners engage with the issues relating to interculturalism and what are the biases that may be at work in this regard. Currently, she is, in addition to her clinical work, she is working at the University of Limerick. And I just want to commend Dr. Grosu, who has her background originally from Moldova and living in the Republic of Ireland for a number of years. Just want to commend her own commitment to the subject matter, that she has looked into it, and as a gift, so to speak, as part of the way in which we built up the capacity for our own SIETAR network. This lecture is being offered this evening. So Dr. Grosu, we welcome you, and we look forward to the presentation that you will make. And we'll be very careful to invite our listeners to note the questions that will be put to you at the end of the session. It's over to you, Dr. Alvina Grosu.
Thank you very much, Livingston. Such a strong introduction. I'll probably introduce myself very simply. I'm a scholar practitioner. I do research and teaching in academia, but I also love practice and application of the research. And any research that has an application to practice is fulfilling its meaning, because that's the whole idea, to bring the knowledge to the masses and improve our living. So in this respect, with the topic on unconscious bias, I saw that there is a lot of knowledge, academic knowledge and research and evidence, that I could delight our listeners, that I presume would be very experienced and knowledgeable in the subject as well. So I took it as a personal challenge to try and impress or try and further the knowledge and the experiences that people attending the webinar would have. So let me start by sharing my slides, and what I would like to signpost to you, very simple objectives that I set up to do in this lecture tonight. Well, I hope it will be more interactive presentation tonight. I would like to define the concept of unconscious bias within the context and give a bit of history. Introduce some related concepts that are used in literature and in the casual vocabulary interchangeably. Present unconscious bias from biopsychosocial perspective, and review the existing evidence on the subject. In other words, the research and the findings to date. So what I'd like you to do to make it a little bit more interactive, I'd like you to take a second and reflect as to what would be your expectations. What would you like to take away from this mini lecture? What would be, I don't know, a piece of knowledge, a piece of information, anything at all? Just focus on your expectation. And just acknowledge it, pin it in your mind. and I know there are many of you out there, over 70 something in, as I could see, 137 participants. Okay, probably including us. That's a lot. So anyway, with that expectation that you've chosen, let me proceed. And I will start by introducing the concept of unconscious bias from historic perspective. The term was coined by 18th century German Romanistic philosopher Friedrich Schiller, and later introduced into English by the poet and essayist Samuel Taylor Coleridge. But mainly it was popularized by Austrian neurologist and psychoanalyst, psychiatrist as well, Sigmund Freud. In psychoanalytic theory, unconscious processes are understood to be directly represented in dreams as well as slips in tongues and jokes. But it was further developed, and the unconscious concept of unconscious was defined as consisting of the processes in the mind which occur automatically and are not available to introspection and include thoughts, processes, memories, interests, and motivations. So that's the concept of unconscious as opposed to conscious mind. So there is this dichotomy that would be good to keep in mind, conscious and unconscious mind. Now, when we're talking about a psychological perspective on unconscious bias, we need to bring into equations the defense mechanisms. So unconscious defense mechanisms were defined and described, again, in psychoanalytic theory as psychological mechanisms that reduces anxiety arising from unacceptable or potentially harmful stimulus. And defense mechanisms may result in healthy or unhealthy consequences depending on circumstances and frequency with which the mechanisms are used. So the defense mechanisms were described by Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, and she listed in her book, she listed about 10 defense mechanisms. I have a video here that I'd like to share with you. And I know it's a risk that I'm taking in terms of technology, but let me try and see if it works. Because rather than me explaining all the defense mechanisms, I prefer it to be done very brief and to the point in a more entertaining manner. So just give me 1 second there.
While Alvina is finding that video.
Yes, I have it.
Good.
What I would like you to do is to let me know whether or not the sound is good. Okay? Okay, thank you.
Anna Freud was the daughter of the founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud. She was born in Vienna in 1895, when her father's radical theories of sex and the mind were starting to make him famous across Europe. She became a school teacher and then a psychoanalyst, and pioneered the treatment of children, establishing clinics and nurseries for children who were war victims, survivors of the Holocaust, or just generally troubled by their lives. Perhaps most importantly for us, she is our finest guide to what we call defense mechanisms, which she described best in her 1936 book, The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense. The book laid out for the first time the core idea that we instinctively try to protect our ego, our acceptable picture of who we are, with a variety of defenses. The problem is that in the act of defending ourselves against pain in the immediate term, we harm our longer-term chances of dealing with reality, and therefore of developing and maturing as a result. Anna Freud highlighted 10 key types of defense mechanisms. Firstly, denial. Denial is when we don't admit there is a problem. We think things like, I enjoy drinking very much, and I sometimes get quite bad hangovers, but I can handle it. If other people try to get us to face up to the problem, we react very badly. The immediate survival mechanism, the short-term instinct to feel all right about oneself, means refusing to recognize our need for change. Projection. In projection, you attribute a bad feeling you have in someone else. For example, you might develop the impression that your partner is going to be extremely critical if you don't make more money this year than last. But in reality, they may be quite understanding and sympathetic. The harsh, bitter thoughts are not in your partner, they're in you, and they came from, let's say, your mother. But you've given the negative feelings, which you don't want to recognize in yourself, to someone else. That's projection. Turning against the self. This is when we think badly of ourselves as a way of escaping from an even worse thought, that someone we hope loves us doesn't actually. Anna Freud learned that children do this a lot. A child abused by a parent will typically seek refuge in a thought which, though grim, is less awful than the alternatives. He or she will think, I must be bad and worthless, that's why my parent is behaving this way towards me. So really the thought goes, I still have a good parent. It's painful to think we're bad and worthless, of course, but for a fragile child especially, it can feel less catastrophic than the alternative. Sublimate when we redirect unacceptable thoughts or emotions, often about sex or violence, into higher and finer channels. Many artists, especially musicians, have used sublimation to turn negative life experiences like drug addiction, social ills, family problems, and so on, into popular and resonant works of art. Sublimation is still a defense mechanism, but it's one of the very best. Regression. Anna Freud believed that when things become tough, we often regress to a way of behaving that we practiced when we were younger. In particular, we do what children typically do, which is evade responsibility. It is for the child always someone else's fault, usually the parents, and they should put it right. In regression, we adopt an infantile sense of our own purity and innocence. The rest of the world is to blame. They should sort it out. For Anna Freud, it's normal for many otherwise perfectly sane adults to go through Rationalization. Rationalization is a smart-sounding excuse for our actions or what happens to us, but it's carefully tailored to get the conclusion we feel we need, that we are innocent, nice, worthy. After being rejected for a job, for example, the defensive rationalizer will say, it was a boring company, or I never wanted the job anyway. They may have very much desired the job, but it can be agonizing and deeply humiliating to admit this to the ego. Intellectualization. Intellectualization is similar. The scarring sense of loss, guilt, betrayal, and anger on breaking up with a partner might be neutralized by thinking a lot about the history of the late Roman Empire or the government's plans to raise interest rates. Many intellectuals are not merely thinking a lot, they are also guilty of intellectualization, which means making sure their researchers keep a range of more pertinent issues at bay. Reaction formation. Reaction formation involves doing the opposite of our initial unacceptable feelings. Someone who has a strong interest in the sexuality of teenagers, say, may join a religion with a particular emphasis on abstinence among the young. We're often guilty of reaction formation in childhood. When we're embarrassed about being attracted to a classmate, we might be mean or aggressive towards them instead of admitting that we like them. Displacement. Displacement is the redirection of a usually aggressive desire to a substitute recipient, usually someone who is less threatening or easier to blame. So a classic case is someone who may feel threatened by their boss, comes home and starts shouting at their partner. Fantasy. Fantasy avoids problems by imagining them away or disassociating oneself from reality. From daydreaming to reading literature to looking at porn. We use these moments to transport ourselves from the threatening world to find comfort in an elsewhere. Anna Freud's tone when writing about defense mechanisms is tender and generous. She knows these defenses are quite natural, but she also observes how many difficulties they bring in their wake. They hold back our careers, they're boring for others, and they hurt those who love us. Freud argued that most of us employ at least 5 of her defense mechanisms every day without being in any way aware of it. She wrote her great book as a way of helping us to see a little better what we're constantly doing, in the hope that we can in future be a little more mature and a little less, as we still say in unknowing tribute to her, defensive towards those around us.
Okay. So going back to the slides, you might wonder why and how the defense mechanisms are related, but that would be probably my challenge to all of you now. And I'd like you to do an exercise with me, a very short, brief exercise. Here are the 10 defense mechanisms, unconscious defense mechanisms presented by, introduced by Anna Freud. And I'd like you all to do, to answer a simple question for me. What do people do when they have a problem? So please choose from the following 10 defense mechanisms. What would be the ones that, from your experience, from your observations, people would use most often? And I know most of you are trainers, so you observed colleagues, students, participants in training, simple people. So the question is, again, what do people do with the problem? Which of those 10 defense mechanisms people most often use? Okay. Lucy Fogarty raised her hand. Can we take that? Is it a question or is it a?
She can write the question in the chat if she likes.
She could write the question in the chat. Okay, very good. So hold that, write them down, write those mechanisms, defense mechanisms that people use when they have problems on a piece of paper or somewhere next to you. Okay, and hold on to that. Once you have it, I will reveal to you that the ones that you have listed, in fact, are your defense mechanisms that just now you've projected on people, as we would say. Anyway, swiftly moving on to the concept of personal and collective bias, unconscious, sorry. Jung, again, a Swiss psychiatrist, developed the concept further, and he agreed with Freud that unconscious is a determinant of personality, but he proposed that unconscious be divided into 2 layers, the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. The personal unconscious is the reservoir of material that was once conscious but has been forgotten or suppressed, much like Freud's notion. But collective unconscious, however, is the deepest level of the psyche, containing the accumulation of inherited psychic structures and archetypal experiences. Archetypes are not memories, but energy centers or psychological functions that are apparent in culture's use of symbols. And the collective unconscious is therefore said to be inherited and containing material of an entire species rather than all of the individual. And that raises the question of the individual unconscious bias as well as collective unconscious biases, which bring us to the racial bias. Okay, so when we're looking again, continuing with the psychological perspective, and I stay with the psychological because I'm a psychologist. In modern cognitive psychology, many researchers have sought to strip the notion of unconscious from its Freudian heritage and introduce alternative terms such as implicit or automatic bias. These traditions emphasize the degree to which cognitive processes happens outside of scope of cognitive awareness and show that things that we are unaware of can nevertheless influence our other cognitive processes as well as behavior. So cognitive research has revealed that automatically and clearly outside of conscious awareness, individuals register and acquire more information than what they can experience through their conscious thoughts. So we have to move to the biological, or kind of a transition between the psychological to biological, kind of brain-mind hardwired biases. Why is this happening? The most frequently mentioned causes would be safety, protection, scanning the environment. Certainly comfort and inclusion and seamlessness, sameness, or similarities to the self. Attraction to noticing novelty, negativity confirmation and evidence of personal perspective, category making, which is complexity, and here you go, or generalization like race, gender, profession, and so on, forming patterns which would help quick processing, and belonging or tribe or closeness or affiliation to a specific group. And these are the needs that would be mainly basic needs, but also in the area of belonging. So in terms of biological perspective, we're looking at neuroscience and particularly the concept of neuroplasticity that implies that the brain is constantly learning and registering, and every experiences that we have and repeatedly do becomes internalized in our brain, and it is registered. Most often it's held within limbic system of memory and emotions, as well as area of the frontal cortex. And we probably know what wire together fires together, but it's flexible. It's not as simple as that. So neural network firing, it's strengthened through associations and repetition, and we call it fast brain or emotional brain that raises quick generalization without details, reporting recall, alternative attention, default mode network, connection to others, cooperation, and fairness. Also, in terms of research in neuroscience, prejudice reactions are linked to structures in the brain that activate rapidly mirror neurons or empathic neurons. And dominant groups and individuals tend to mirror others less than non-dominant groups or individual. In other words, dominant equals more power and less empathy. Cognitive components of intergroup bias have negative or positive cognitive association. Encoded storage association influence one's perception and behavior. And it is social knowledge is in the anterior temporal lobe. The social impressions is in prefrontal cortex. Also, semantic learning and memory are embedded in mechanisms for language or verbalizing, and believed to be supported by phylogenetically newer networks of neocortical structures that are significantly expanded among human comparing to those of other species. Because mirror neuron and empathy exists in other species as well. Now, again, when we're speaking about unconscious bias and the neuroscience, we need to mention the amygdala, which is functioning on automatic detection of fear or threat or mistrust. And the results from the research on animals and humans suggest that amygdala is associated with subcortical circuits and is central to affective learning and memory. In other words, fear drives our learning and memory. Now, also on amygdala, most of us probably know it as system of thinking, yeah, system 1 and system 2. The first reactions would be the subconscious mind is processing 95% of information, and then the conscious mind processing just 5% of information. So literature suggests that amygdala activation is from a conditioned threat or mistrust. And reactivity to racial outgroups increase the bias when stressed, approved by authority or peer pressure. Inconsistencies between subjects' perception of prejudice and behavior bias expression found from research measures such as EAT, and most of you probably heard of association, intention, and cognition level. Probably heard of this test, and I'll come to the EAT later. Semantic associations are likely embedded in disrupted networks and in association cortex, and those may influence social group, social cognition by biasing other higher order information processing, such as when inferring the beliefs and intentions of other people. Here is more research on amygdala and functioning of amygdala, but what I want to mention here, a limiting factor in this line of inquiry is that in the previous research, independent assessment of implicit stereotyping and evaluative race bias have not been obtained, and it has not been possible to determine the conceptual relationship of implicit stereotyping and evaluative race biases and their potentially unique effects on behavior. So there isn't research as such in neuroscience that would prove correlation between the implicit stereotyping or implicit bias and the amygdala and the reactions. So the problems are there because it's difficult to detect, control, or change. And cultural reinforcement and emotional cognitive association and the subconscious, unconscious nature of the mind also create a problem because there is no clear border between conscious or unconscious mind. Biases, tendencies regulated from the brain structure for cognitive control, perspective thinking, empathy, and conflict processing, response inhibition would be, again, difficult to measure. Subjects with positive attitudes towards outgroups showed greater activity in the left prefrontal cortex. So, in other words, when we're talking about unconscious bias, the regulation or the neurophysiology of it is from top to the bottom, from conscious to unconscious. And it is possible to regulate when there is intention, okay? So how do we mitigate or how do we regulate the unconscious biases? With left prefrontal cortical activation, which is slow brain thinking or slow thinking, in that respect, it's a switch between a sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So you're not in fight and fly mode, triggered by the fear. You are in rest and digest mode so that you could process those information. Again, the mirror neuron are common to humanity, and compassion, which would be another way to mitigate the unconscious bias through compassion and empathy. acknowledging your bias, self-awareness of reaching differently, reacting differently to certain groups of people, brings the unconscious bias into consciousness. So you becoming aware of your limitations. And again, once you become aware, then this process of mitigation starts as to why. Where is it rooted? Why do you need to activate those defense mechanisms to perceive people of certain groups or certain ages? Mindfulness is another very popular trend in mitigating unconscious bias, and again, linking it to language and thinking, and forming those new associations or positive reframing of those triggers or fears. Now, the third perspective that I want to bring you is the social perspective on unconscious bias. And the social identity theory presents unconscious bias as implicit bias or implicit stereotype. These are, again, interchangeably used concepts in literature. And it is pre-reflected attribution of particular qualities by an individual to a member of some social out-group. And this concept of out-grouping is also another term that is often used. So explicit bias encompasses our conscious attitudes, which can be measured by self-reporting, but pose the potential of individuals falsely endorsing more socially desirable attitudes. So in other words, conscious or explicit bias. Although implicit or unconscious bias have been considered unconscious and involuntary attitudes which lie below the surface of consciousness. Some people seem to be aware of the influences of their behavior and cognitive processes. So I have another video here to show you the difference between implicit and explicit, but I'm not sure how am I doing in terms of time. Because I have quite a few videos. I might power off, power on and keep going. So implicit bias is an aspect of the implicit social cognition and the phenomena that perceptions, attitudes, and stereotypes can operate prior to conscious intention or endorsement. Implicit stereotypes are thought to be shaped by experience and based on learned associations between particular qualities of social categories, including race and or gender. These two were mainly the focus of research. Individuals' perceptions and behavior can be influenced by implicit stereotypes, and they hold, even if they are sometimes unaware, they hold such stereotypes. So implicit stereotypes were introduced by Mazarin Banaji. You probably might have heard about the research and the researcher herself. So just 2 seconds. I'll show the video in a second. And the existence of implicit bias is supported by a variety of scientific articles in psychological literature. So explicit stereotype, by contrast, are consciously endorsed, intentional, and sometimes controllable thoughts and beliefs. Implicit biases, however, are thought to be the product of associations learned through past experiences. So implicit biases can be activated by the environment and operate prior to person's intentional or conscious endorsement. So let me try and bring you Mazarin so that you could hear it from the horse's mouth.
Well,
How am I doing in terms of time?
Well, I think, Alvina, you can carry on for another 15 minutes, and then we take some questions.
Okay, very good. Sorry about the timing. Switching between screens is takes some skill. Here we go. I'm an experimental psychologist. I teach at Harvard University. I've been fascinated by two things. We call them attitudes, and we call them beliefs. These are thoughts and feelings that are in our minds. We can't see them, we can't touch them. So how to go about measuring them is the interesting question. And for more than 100 years, psychologists have been at this task of trying to understand, trying to get out of people what their thoughts and feelings are. These particular thoughts and feelings that I'm interested in are attitudes and beliefs that we hold about social groups, okay? And how we use those beliefs that we have about the group as a whole. You know, the Swiss are like this, or the Germans are like that. How do we use those beliefs in then our judgments about individual people who happen to be members of the group? So that's the interesting question. And as I said, for over 100 years, people have been measuring them in the form of attitudes or prejudices that we might hold, thoughts or beliefs or stereotypes that we may have about different groups of people. How to go about doing this is the question. And we know one easy way to do it, and that is to ask people, what do you think about X? How likely is it that people from this group will be able to do something of this kind or that kind? What is their inner nature? Are they competitive? Are they collaborative? Are they smart? Are they not very smart? Are they trustworthy? Are they not trustworthy? Things like that. And so I would just ask. But then asking has some problems, right? There are two problems with asking people. First of all, if you ask me what I think about X, I may not want to tell you about that because that's a private belief and I don't want to share it with you. But there is a second problem with asking, and that is the one I'm most interested in. That is that we may not know our own minds. You see, our brains do a lot of work silently, quietly. We don't have access to all of it. And we don't necessarily have access to the contents of our mind. We don't know, this may seem strange to you, but we don't know what our actual attitudes might be or what our thoughts and beliefs are. So as scientists, our job is to try to figure out indirect ways into people's minds to draw out what might actually exist there that even they may not know. So the work that I have been doing for the last, close to 40 years now is work on trying to get at the implicit or the unconscious or the less visible, even to ourselves, contents of our minds. We've developed tests like the IAT, or the Implicit Association Test, which we use to bypass, to get away from asking people what they might think or feel, and instead just trying to see what might be in their minds. So we might look, for example, at how rapidly or how quickly or how accurately you can put two things together. And the test will reveal, in a sense, what it is that might be sitting in your mind that you may not know about. So I'll give you an example just with me. I am a woman. I have worked outside the home all my life. And yet, when I take a test that requires me to associate female with career and male with home, I can't seem to do that as well as if you gave me the opposite. If you ask me to associate female with home and male with career, that turns out to be relatively easy for my brain to do. Why?
I don't have this belief that women don't belong in the workplace or anything like that. And yet, my brain contains the thumbprint of the culture in which I live. And that culture has repeatedly associated female and home more so than male and home. And that's now in my head. That's the important discovery, that we can say consciously, we can say explicitly what we think and feel. That's one way in which our minds work. But there is another part of our mind where these associations that are picked up, sucked out of the culture and sit there, they're there all the time. Where do they come from? One of the things that we've been very interested in is looking at young children. How do young children come to have the beliefs and attitudes that they do? Do they learn it slowly as they grow up and so on? And our data suggests now that children are very open to what's going on in their culture. And at a very early age, at ages like 2 and 3, we can see evidence that they have in their minds attitudes and stereotypes of the sort we see in adults. So what we now know is that these are picked up pretty quickly and that they exist in the minds of children even at that age. But they're not always visible, but we can see them in things like conversations. So a student of mine, Tessa Charlesworth, has recently been analyzing data from parents and children. These are conversations that parents and children have had, and there are thousands of such conversations. And we can use an approach called natural language processing. We can use machine learning to look at whether in the language that parents are using, they actually are relying on these stereotypes that they have no clue that they are. When you ask parents, they'll tell you, I don't know where their child picked this up from because I don't teach it to them. And yet when we analyze these conversations that parents and children have had, we can see in those conversations evidence that parents are indeed associating, for example, female things and male more with career things.
Okay.
We just want to apologize for the quality of that sound clip. There were a number of people saying, Alvina, the sound was not good. So
it wasn't good.
Yes.
It wasn't good, yeah. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, I don't know where am I? What am I sharing now? Okay. Apologies for that. If needs be, I could put in the links in the chat to those videos so people could listen or could watch them in their own time. Now, the measurements, the EAT, the implicit association test that was designed by researchers, and also there are other measurements like go-on-go association task or semantic priming and lexical decision task or sentence completion. I'll talk in a second about the implicit association test because it's the biggest tool used by researchers to conduct, to collect data in relation to unconscious or implicit bias or stereotypes. Now, in summary, again, there is research done in Virginia and Harvard, and those studies examined 426 studies looked through and that were collected over 20 years, involving 72,000 participants, and that used EAT or other similar tests to collect data. So the findings from those thematic from those systematic reviews of the literature actually showed that there is little evidence that changes the implicit bias correlate with changes in person's behavior. So in other words, if the implicit bias is changed, it does not mean that the person will start behaving differently. And again, another meta-analysis that was conducted more recently described that it's this misinterpretation is due to the proxy of unconscious, and for the EAT provides little insight into who will discriminate against whom, and provide no more insight than explicit measures of bias. So in other words, the data that is collected through implicit association test or other measurements or other tools is not reliable. To close off on this summary, I'll show you in a minute another piece of video, but I'd like to point you out to the researchers that have a name in the field of unconscious bias. As I said, Mazarin Banaji, Anthony Greenwald, and Malcolm Gladwell. You might have read Malcolm Gladwell books on slicing and perception. David Amodio would be known in the in the field of neuroscience. And Susan Fiske would be more within the area of social psychology. But having said that, let me try once again to bring you the last piece of video that will...
We will let you know if the sound is good enough, Alvina, because the last one, the sound wasn't great. If it's not great, then we will end it, and then you can round off, and then we go and have the discussion and the questions.
Okay. Let us give another another go. Just 2 seconds. Okay.
Know that we all possess implicit bias. And that
Sorry.
if we genuinely discuss the implicit association test, the IAT, which is now the most popular tool for measuring implicit.
Okay.
While we bring the video up, we just want the just know that in a little while we're going to be taking your questions in the chat, and we will try to respond to some of them. And then we'll tell you about the panel discussion we're going to be having on this subject matter on the 2nd of June. Alvina, are you ready?
Just 1 second. There is a glitch.
Yeah. I wonder whether we would not skip the video, Alvina, maybe to use the time instead to respond to some of the queries that individuals may have about what you said already.
Well, if there could be questions written in the chat box, that would be good. But this particular video, why am I insisting on finding it, or why it's not working for me? Because it's the one that actually challenges most. Okay, it challenges most us as trainers and researchers in the area of unconscious bias. So
you can also share the link with people so they can look at it.
Yes, I could do that as well. Okay, I have it. So I will have the link. Sorry. Okay. I'll try and share it from YouTube and see if it works.
Of what our brains process is unconscious. And without a doubt, somewhere in there are biases.
How is the sound so far?
Okay.
Biases about women in the workplace, biases about people of different races. And all of these biases are things companies like Google, Starbucks, and even Insider have been trying to train out of their workforce for years. But is it working?
We don't know. We really don't know.
And a lot of that uncertainty has to do with our understanding of implicit bias in general. So what do we know? Implicit biases are stereotypes that we form about certain groups of people. Every day, your amygdala processes and categorizes billions of stimuli. And because of this, almost all of it is happening automatically. Every experience you have, every bit of socialization, every piece of media is processed and stored by a stereotyping neural network, creating a database of shortcuts that your brain can pull from. And while it's helpful to see a big metal box with wheels and immediately know it's a car, categorizing people in the same way is harmful. And that's where the implicit association test comes in. The IAT is part of many implicit bias trainings. It's supposed to establish a baseline for each participant's unconscious biases by measuring them. The problem is, we don't actually know if it does that.
I think that the implicit association test is an imperfect measure. It's been incredibly useful for researchers to understand how the mind works in ways that are not self-reported. But if you want to use it as a diagnostic measure of how racist or sexist you are or something like that, it's not going to tell you that.
A psychological test is usually measured in two ways: reliability and validity. Test-retest reliability means that people should be able to take the test over and over again and get nearly the same results each time. A perfect reliability score is a 1, but a test is solid if it scores at least 0.7. But studies have put the race IAT's reliability at 0.44 and the IAT overall at 0.5, well below acceptable standards. This means when a person takes the test multiple times, they get notably different results. And experts can't say for sure whether that's because the test is a bad tool or if the concept of implicit bias actually fluctuates.
So one of the theoretical ambiguities right now about the nature of implicit bias is the extent to which it reflects something deep about a personality or an enduring attitude versus something that is more fickle, something more like an emotional state or a mood.
Either way, this discrepancy makes it difficult to rely on the results of the test. Which leads us to validity. Does the test actually predict what it says it does? The IAT was intended to and is currently used in a way that is supposed to link implicit bias to behaviors. At least 4 different meta-analyses between 2007 and 2015 looked at this exact thing, and all of them suggest that the IAT doesn't really predict behaviors that well.
It turns out that predicting discrimination is just difficult, full stop.
But even if the IAT was conclusively valid and reliable, implicit bias trainings still have a problem. Acknowledging your bias does not mean you're going to act less racist. At least one study found that recognizing a bias is a necessary step to getting rid of it. It won't solve the problem on its own.
You want to make people feel enough motivation, maybe something like enough guilt or shame to be actually motivated to do something about the problem of bias or discrimination.
And some studies suggest that the trainings can even make the problem worse. They have the potential to dredge up stereotypes and make a person act on them more. So how do we make sure that implicit bias trainings are effective? Standardizing the programs is a start.
I've seen ones where the IAT is never mentioned, let alone used in any way. I've seen ones where they put implicit bias in the middle of the thing and they do it as a group activity. Some of them are just purely just a collection of PowerPoint slides with nothing else kind of attached.
One 2016 meta-analysis of over 40 years of diversity training data found that the programs were successful if they focused on skill development and were conducted over a long period of time. Many trainings end up being reactionary, half-day or shorter events that end up being more performative than impactful. It's like using a Band-Aid to treat a broken bone instead of a comprehensive treatment plan.
Exactly. You might not be so certain that any individual one of them, their diversity and inclusion outcomes tend to be better.
Harvard Business Review found that a combination of things like college recruitment, mentoring programs, self-managed teams, and task forces have increased diversity. Diversity task forces alone boosted Black women in management by 23%. Instead of focusing on the thoughts of the individual employees, these tactics address the bigger systemic issues that make bias a problem in the first place. So just because we don't know for sure if implicit bias trainings work doesn't mean they can't. We should be asking ourselves what we do know we can do differently in order to ensure lasting change. I just want to be very clear that the information we're presenting here has to do with implicit bias trainings and their effect on diversity and inclusion within companies. Bias is very much real and is something that we as individuals need to continue being aware of, checking, and unlearning. So please continue the conversation in the comments below and in real life, and subscribe for more deep science.
Okay. On that note, I'll hand it over to you, Livingston.
Thank you, Alvina. Thank you. And we just want to say how much we appreciate that presentation. And before we go,
Connected.
Sorry. That's me, sound-wise. Okay, my apologies. Glitch.
And before we go into the questions, let me remind our participants that on the 2nd of June, we're going to be having a panel discussion. This panel discussion will be addressing the issues relating to training that would have been raised by this last video. And there are 3 important panelists we're going to be having who are going to be with us on that day. We're going to be having Nita Sharma, who's based in the UK, Robert Gibson, who's based in Germany, and Stacey Gordon, who's based in the United States. All 3 individuals are practitioners, and they are individuals who are have used and have a view relating to the use of unconscious bias training. So we want to explore with them that what is the state of this subject matter or this issue called unconscious bias training, given what we know that is being said in terms of attitude of government, and given some of the things that have been raised today here by Alvina. And Alvina, we will take 1 or 2 questions, but many individuals asked that you would have placed within the chat the link to some of those videos. They would have, of course, been able to better hear them with the links being placed there. And I just want to then go to the chat to see whether we have 1 or 2 questions. And the last video in particular, individuals were saying that video is interesting. I'm going to invite you then, participants, just to formulate what questions we might put to Alvina, and I will take certainly a few of them. Naturally, with still nearly 90 of you present, we may not be able to take all if we had 90 questions, but certainly we look to see the ones that you have. While they are doing that, Alvina, I wonder if I may put a question to you. I was very challenged by the idea, it's shown in the last video, but you raised this point that the fact that an individual may become aware of the existence of their implicit bias, it does not necessarily lead to a change of behavior. So the awareness does not necessarily lead to change of behavior. You want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, because once you are aware of your unconscious biases or implicit biases or stereotypes that you're using to describe people or relate to people, it's in your conscious level, okay? But very often, the stereotypes and the biases are kicked in subconsciously just simply because we are triggered, and we are triggered by unknown. And it's probably a millisecond there that our brain quickly processes the information and gets into this fear mode or fight or flight, or freeze mode, and goes automatically into reacting to those stimulus as the brain was conditioned to do, as it was repeatedly done, and almost without awareness or control over, we are reacting to it. Post-factum, we could catch it up and say, well, what did I do? Why did I say that? You know? But it is that tension or that conflict that exists between our conscious mind and subconscious mind.
Yeah. Now, Alvina, as a psychologist, of course, you are, you know the field very well, and I suspect that many of the individuals who use, who are trainers may not be themselves PhD in psychology and would have studied into the issues relating to unconscious bias in the way in which you have studied it. How important it is for individuals to have, if you like, expert knowledge of the field to be able to make it application of it?
Not necessarily that you need to have expert knowledge in the field. And when you say expert knowledge, I presume you mean research and evidence that relates to it. Because nowadays the research is publicized and it's presented in very accessible manner to anybody. That's the whole idea, to popularizing the research. But the key concepts that you're using or people are using in training, it's better that there is the evidence behind them, or it's better that it's informed decisions and choices that are made, because there is a vocabulary in the area of training that we use, and it's good to give the definitions and set the tone from the very beginning, so that people are clear that implicit bias is the same as unconscious bias, is the same as the implicit stereotypes, and so on. So in that respect, it's synonymous. So knowing the terminology, knowing what is out there, and the measure, as it was mentioned, the implicit association test, it's a good tool, and it's a good exercise to actually do with participants. And it's and before you do it with participants, my strong recommendation would be to do it for yourself. So you'd be surprised what results you'd come up with. And by the way, it's not just race and age. These two particular ones were very well publicized due to Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and all the political social context. But there are other implicit biases in terms of sexualities and in terms of occupations and in terms of religions and so on. So I would recommend that us as experts or trainers and researchers in the field, we know our own implicit biases first. We learn to connect with our unconscious minds. That's the reason why I did the defense mechanisms exercise with people, so that they raise their own awareness about the self.
Yeah, Alvina, many of the researchers, I mean, going back to Sigmund Freud and his daughter and so on, these Europeans, at the time at which they did their research, certainly we know historically they were very extremely poor attitudes and thoughts that they have to Black people, for example. Yeah. And no doubt they would have formed some of their ideas about individuals relating to that kind of the bias that they themselves worked with. How do you comment on this fact that we tend to rely on European and American research in relation to the subject matter, and whether or not people of color, Black people, should use with us this approach, this research with a certain amount of health warning, so to speak, because of the biases that are already inbuilt in it? Do you want to comment on that?
Yes, you could say that the research itself is biased in that respect, and it might very well be so, because we're all humans, we have our own subjective perceptions or perspectives. Even and with that, I will open the bracket and say, for example, Jung did not have those attitudes towards Black or African people. That's why he came up with the concept of collective unconscious or archetypes, and presented it in more kind of philosophical terms. But going back to the research, My comment would be that we would need to do more research, and the research by researchers from different, I think, my backgrounds would be very well welcomed. As you probably noticed, the Harvard University researchers, they are not necessarily all English or all white or middle class and so on. You'd have a combination, and the data that is collected by implicit association tests, by the way, it's free. It's a website, and it's called the Project Implicit. Is collaged, and it is registering where you're from in terms of your own identity, nationality. So I would say it's all ahead of us. And if there is awareness that there is the need for more research is there, then why not?
Yeah. We're going to wrap it up about 2 minutes, Alvina, but there's a question relating to tools that individuals might get. What tools are there for people to help increase self-awareness towards their implicit bias? You want to comment a little bit about tools for raising awareness?
The biggest one is EAT, implicit association test, or the project implicit. Let me try and put some links for you in the chat, because that's one. Okay, and I'm not sure how can I send it in the chat box. I'll just put it in.
Yes.
So here is one tool. Oh, by the way, this is the video to Mazarin, the one that didn't have very good sound. And here is the link to the implicit project in the Harvard University. And I could give a bit more. Here is another article in relation to the history of unconscious bias that might be of interest to our participants. And in terms of other tools, I would recommend reviewing the projective tests or methods. Okay, but they are more specialized depending on the interests. Once again, if you prefer tools like tests or activities, or if you prefer tools like more of explorative narrative discussion tools, here are my recommendations.
Thanks, Alvina. Well, this is very helpful, and I just want to say then how appreciative we are for the individuals who joined us today on the session. We are going to wrap up now and look forward to our session on the 2nd of June. Remember that session, Robert and Nita and Stacy will address specifically the issue of what's the state of play as far as their use of unconscious bias training in training is concerned. So, Alvina, thank you very much for having joined us today. Thank you for the lecture. Papa is over, back to you.
My pleasure.
So much, Alvina, for this great presentation. Thank you also, Livingston Thomas, for this moderation. I just want to say thank you to everyone and tell you again, on the 2nd of June, we're gonna have the next session, and also maybe a couple of days, you're gonna see this session in our YouTube channel. Nothing else. Thank you for coming, and hope to see you again. Bye.
Thank you all very much. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See you on the 2nd of June.
Okay.